A student who had just graduated from university and was about to return home to her parents disappeared in the middle of the night under strange circumstances. Detectives found several witnesses who shared very creepy observations with them. However, they were unable to get to the bottom of the truth. Several years later, all the participants in this case were awaiting a very unusual turn of events, thanks to which it was solved. Julie Basken was born on October 24, 1975 in Benton, Arkansas. She was the only child in her family. Before her arrival, her parents had a son, but he died in infancy. From a young age, the girl was fascinated with ballet and began to practice it professionally during her school years. Julie regularly performed at local dance events, achieving outstanding results. Even before finishing school, she knew exactly what she wanted to do in the future. The girl planned to open her own dance studio and teach children ballet. She could not imagine her life without this art and wanted to share her experience with others. Julie was determined not only in ballet but also in her studies. Thanks to her excellent academic performance, she managed to get into the University of Oklahoma on a scholarship that covered tuition. She moved to Norman, where her university was located, and settled in a rented apartment near the university. The girl also got a job at a golf course, balancing work with her studies. After graduating from university, Julie planned to return to her home state, obtain a degree in child education, and open her own ballet studio closer to home. In December 1996, when Julie was 21, she received a bachelor's degree in dance and planned to return home for Christmas. Her parents were supposed to come for her to help her move her things back to Benton. On December 19, the day before her departure, the girl met with her friends from the university. They exchanged Christmas gifts, had a good time, and said goodbye. After that, Julie drove home to her friend, whom she had promised to give a ride to the airport. They needed to be there by 5 a.m., so the girls decided not to sleep all night. They packed her things, had a snack at a 24-hour cafe, and around 4:30, they left for the airport. The trip took about half an hour. Julie said goodbye to her friend and drove home, planning to get some sleep before leaving. Around 5:30 a.m., the police received a call from a resident of the same complex where Julie lived. He said he was awakened by a piercing female scream, which apparently came from the street. The man looked out the window but saw nothing suspicious. 20 minutes later, the police sent a patrol officer to the scene, who inspected the area around the residential complex and found no signs of a crime, after which he left. Around 11 a.m., Julie's friend and colleague from the golf course, Ryan, came to her apartment. They had arranged to meet and have breakfast together to say goodbye before her departure. The young man immediately noticed that her car was missing from the parking lot. This was strange, as the girl was only supposed to leave home in the evening, and in the morning, she planned to catch up on sleep after driving her friend to the airport. Ryan knocked on her apartment door, but there was no answer. After waiting a few more minutes, he decided to return to work and check on her later. His shift ended around 4 p.m., and he came back to her apartment. The car was still missing, and no one answered the door knock. This time, the young man began to worry. Julie's parents were supposed to arrive soon, and she was nowhere to be found. At that time, nobody had mobile phones, so Ryan went to his home where he lived with his grandparents. They and Julie occasionally called each other on the landline, and the boy hoped she had called him at home. However, his relatives said that there had been no calls from Julie all day. After that, Ryan's grandfather suggested driving around the places where the girl might be. They went to the university, the airport, and several other locations, but they couldn't find Julie or her car. Then Ryan's grandfather decided to contact the local police chief, with whom they were longtime friends. The man told him all the details of this situation, and the police officer agreed to take on the case. He immediately found out that early in the morning of the same day, someone called 911, having heard a loud female scream right in front of Julie's residential complex. This suggested that something really terrible might have happened to the girl, and the investigators decided to question the other neighbors. Among them was a police officer who also woke up from the scream. He went outside, checked the parking lot in front of the house, but saw nothing unusual. Another neighbor told a much more disturbing story. After the scream was heard on the street, he heard a man say, "Shut up and get in the car." Then there were 2 car door slams, after which the car quickly drove off. The neighbor did not see what happened, but what he heard was enough to come to a grim conclusion. Apparently, Julie was abducted right in front of her home. Soon after the police were still questioning the other neighbors, the girl's parents arrived at the residential complex. Instead of helping her pack her things and head home, they learned from the officers that their daughter was missing. For them, it was a real shock. They had spoken with Julie the day before the incident, and now they were faced with the fact that the girl had disappeared under very alarming circumstances. That same evening, a man called the police, saying that he was walking along the lake around noon and noticed something strange in the water. He couldn't tell what it was, but it seemed to him like it might be a human body. The man was doubtful that it was actually a dead person, so he didn't immediately contact the police. After returning home, he kept thinking about it and told his wife, after which they decided to go back to the spot and take another look. The couple concluded that it indeed looked like a human body and called 911. Officers arrived at the lake with rescuers and retrieved the body from the water. It was a young woman with a gunshot wound to the head, and her hands were tied with a shoelace. Additionally, her jeans were unbuttoned and slightly pulled down, indicating sexual motives for the crime. The police almost immediately identified the deceased as Julie. On a lakeshore, they'd also found a jacket that belonged to the girl. After examining the body, medical experts confirmed that the victim had been subjected to violence before being killed with a firearm. They'd also found traces of male biological material on Julie's jacket, from which they extracted a DNA sample. In 1996, the FBI's database was not yet widespread across all states, so the police could only rely on direct DNA comparison with the sample of suspects. After talking to the victim's parents, detectives also learned that the girl always wore a ring that they had given her. However, the ring was not found on the body or in the victim's apartment, leading the police to believe that the murderer had taken it with him. Another potential lead was found on the lake shore. There were 2 sets of footprints that led into the water and only one set coming back. The detectives believed that after the murder, the criminal dragged the body into the water and then returned alone, so the footprints of his shoes were added to the case file as evidence. The police first set out to find Julie's car, as everything indicated that the abductor had taken the girl to the lake in it. Considering the witness's statements, he could have approached her at the moment Julie arrived home and got out of the car. The criminal then told her to sit in the passenger seat, threatening her with a weapon, while he drove to the lake, which was about 15 minutes away. After news reports circulated about the search for a red Mitsubishi Eagle Summit, the police received several calls from witnesses. One woman said she saw a similar car around 6:30 a.m. a man was driving, and a young woman sat next to him. The witness added that the girl looked scared, while the man seemed irritated and even angry. Another witness, passing near the lake around 7:15, also saw this car. He nearly got into an accident because the Red Eagle Summit cut him off, leading him to chase the car, intending to confront the driver. However, the driver did not stop and eventually turned onto a dirt road, prompting the witness to head home. Before leaving, he managed to see that a man was driving, but there was no one else in the cabin. Both individuals provided the police with a description of the driver, which allowed them to create a composite sketch of him. He was described as a young Latino man with long dark hair. This image was circulated in the media, hoping for the public's help in identifying the person. That same evening, detectives unexpectedly found the victim's car. It was located in a residential complex parking lot, literally across the street from Julie's home. This area wasn't directly visible from her house, so the police couldn't have seen the car from there. The situation was quite strange. It appeared that the killer abducted Julie in front of her home, took her to the lake, and then returned to the same area to park the car across the street from the victim's complex. This suggested that he must have lived nearby. Inside the car, police found pajama pants belonging to Julie, on which experts later discovered traces of male biological material. Sand was also found under the driver's seat, presumably from the lake's shore. Despite this, forensic analysts found no other evidence that could be linked to the killer. The police discovered that the girl's mobile phone and CD player were missing from the car. They requested information on the phone's activity on the night of the murder from the cell phone provider. Something strange awaited them. 2 calls were made from it early in the morning. However, according to the medical experts' assessments and witness statements, Julie was already dead by that time, indicating the killer made the calls. The first was a call to a service that provided a weather forecast, and the second was to a non-existent phone number. All of this was very odd, but didn't help the police get any closer to catching the criminal. Afterwards, detectives decided to study in more detail the shoe prints left in the sand by the presumed killer. They quickly identified them as Nike sneakers and asked the company for assistance. The company determined that the prints were made by a size 42 Air 2 model. However, this information also didn't help them get any closer to catching the perpetrator. In the months that followed, no new leads emerged in the case. The detectives set themselves the task of collecting DNA samples from all men who were acquainted with Julie or lived near her. This process took a very long time. Eventually, the police tested the DNA of over 200 men, but there were no matches among them. Ultimately, the case went cold for several years. 4.5 years later, detectives suddenly received a new lead. A woman serving time in an Oklahoma prison contacted them with intriguing information. According to her, she had seen the composite sketch of the suspect in Julie's case, and it resembled a 23-year-old man she knew named Dennis. The police began to investigate this individual and discovered that at the time of Julie's murder, he lived just a few streets away from her home. Furthermore, Dennis indeed resembled the composite sketch. The detectives reached out to him, but the man refused to answer their questions or provide a DNA sample. Consequently, the police obtained a court order requiring him to submit his biological material, which he did. The results from the lab presented the detectives with a very unexpected turn. The experts established a partial match between the killer's sample and Dennis's DNA, but it wasn't a complete match. This often happens when forensic scientists only have a partial DNA sample of the criminal. However, in Julie's case, this was not so. The experts had obtained a full sample from the suspect's biological material. In such cases, the results mean that Dennis was definitely not the killer, but he was highly likely related by blood to the DNA owner. Detectives immediately found out that Dennis's only living relative was his biological brother, and they approached him. After his DNA sample was sent to the lab, the police were in for another surprise. It did not match the biological material found on Julie's clothing. This put the investigators at a dead end. Cases where a suspect's DNA partially matches the killer's sample are not very common. The detectives were almost certain that Dennis's brother would turn out to be the criminal, but in the end, both men were not involved. They had no other close male relatives, and the case again hit a dead end. It was later transferred to the cold case unit, but even there, no new leads were found. This went on for several more years, until something unexpected happened in July 2004. An FBI agent contacted the investigators from the cold case unit, informing them that the DNA sample from Julie's case had found a match in their database. In 2002, the police had arrested a man named Anthony Sanchez for assaulting his ex-girlfriend and committing a robbery. During the investigation, they took a DNA sample from him, which was later entered into the FBI's database. This sample matched exactly the one entered into the database from Julie's murder case. Detectives immediately resumed the investigation and went to the prison to see Anthony to confirm his involvement. They took his DNA sample and conducted a direct comparison with the sample obtained from the criminal's biological material. The result was the same. Upon investigating Sanchez's background, the police found out that at the time of Julie's murder, he lived just a mile and a half from her complex. He also had an extensive criminal history, primarily consisting of thefts and robberies. Detectives contacted his ex-girlfriend, with whom Anthony was living at the time of the murder. She told them that in that very month, the guy had gifted her a pair of Nike sneakers and bought a pair for himself as well. It was the AR-2 model, size 42. She corroborated her story with an entry in her personal diary from December 1996, where she described both pairs. Another ex-girlfriend of Sanchez shared another interesting story. She said that the guy and his father liked to shoot a pistol at walls inside the house, likely under the influence of various substances. Detectives speculated that bullets might have remained in the walls, which could be compared with the one that killed Julie. They obtained a search warrant for the house, dismantled the walls, and eventually found a bullet of the same .22 caliber. This in itself didn't prove Sanchez's guilt, but experts discovered something else. Both bullets were fired from a similar weapon, which had quite rare rifling. This suggested that the bullet that killed Julie was very likely fired from the same pistol used by Sanchez and his father. Soon, the police made another intriguing discovery. Remember those 2 calls made from Julie's phone after her death? Detectives found out that the non-existent number the criminal dialed differed by just 1 digit from Sanchez's girlfriend's number. Apparently, he tried to dial it from memory, but made a mistake by 1 digit and accidentally entered a non-existent number. All this, along with the DNA match, was enough to bring the case to trial. Sanchez denied his involvement and tried to convince everyone that he had nothing to do with the murder. His lawyer insisted that the evidence at hand didn't prove his guilt. For instance, Sanchez's fingerprints were not found in the victim's car, and the DNA analysis could be mistaken. However, experts denied such a possibility, stating that an error was virtually impossible since the chance of it happening was 1 in 94 trillion. Eventually, the jury unanimously found him guilty, resulting in Sanchez being sentenced to death. As usual, the wait between the sentencing and its execution stretched over many years, during which quite interesting developments occurred in the case. After Sanchez was found guilty, he filed several appeals for a case review, but all were rejected. Later, he began claiming that it was actually his father who committed the murder, a man who had taken his own life in 2006. This story started circulating in the media again, and Sanchez garnered support from death penalty opponents. However, the judge overseeing the case stated that the theory of the father's involvement made no sense. Even if he had been alive, the evidence would still point to his son. The fact that Sanchez's DNA perfectly matched the biological material found on the victim's clothing ruled out his innocence. If the biological material had belonged to his father, the comparison result would have been close but not exact. Despite this, a campaign was launched in support of Sanchez, trying to abolish his death sentence. Later, the former girlfriend of his father claimed that the man had confessed to her several times about killing Julie. The woman allegedly kept this secret for many years out of fear. However, her story lacked any verification. The former prosecutor who worked on the case suggested that this entire narrative might have been fabricated by those seeking to abolish the death penalty, as shifting blame onto deceased individuals is a common tactic. In 2015, Sanchez had a new chance to avoid death when Oklahoma introduced a moratorium on the death penalty, though it was lifted in 2021. Later, a special commission finally set a date for Sanchez's execution. It was scheduled for September 21, 2023. Efforts were made to prevent it, and Sanchez's supporters even gathered over 10,000 signatures on related petitions. However, they were met with a rather strange turn of events. Recently, in June 2023, Sanchez was given the opportunity to appear before the Pardon and Parole Board, led by the state governor. This individual has the discretion to cancel death sentences, but Sanchez simply refused to participate. He explained this by stating he didn't believe in a successful outcome. Over the years in prison, he had seen many inmates appear before the commission, but their sentences were upheld. Ultimately, he declined the chance for clemency, so as not to turn his hopes into disappointment. Such a move casts doubt on his claim of innocence. If Sanchez truly did not kill Julie, it would have been extremely foolish of him to refuse a chance to avoid death. Julie's parents never believed in Sanchez's innocence, because the case attracted wide attention from death penalty opponents. Julie's mother and father were repeatedly criticized. Some people seriously accused them of not being interested in finding their daughter's real killer. Nevertheless, the parents remained grateful to the investigators and trial participants for bringing the case to a conclusion. They also thanked the University of Oklahoma, where Julie studied. The institution established a dance scholarship in her name, allowing students who shared Julie's love of dance to study for free. Anthony Sanchez's execution was carried out on September 21, 2023 as planned. He was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, with the time of death declared at 10:19 a.m.